Forgotten. Chapter 6. The war continued, relentless without respite or mercy. The days faded away in the mist of dust and blood, while the soldiers clung to the hope that the end was near, although they knew deep down that the end of the war would mean the beginning of other battles. Battles that would not be fought with weapons, but with the memories that dragged with each step. Lucas, scarred by suffering and anger, still carried on, a shadow of his former self. His eyes no longer shone with youthful passion, but with cold determination. The nickname Bag of Blood no longer seemed like a taunt, but a reality. Every day, the wounds and scars seemed to accumulate faster than they could heal. Paul at his side shared the same exhaustion, but his dark humor and insomnia had become a way of coping with the abyss that surrounded them. They had both given up hope for a quiet life. The war had become a sentence from which they could not escape. The platoon commander, now more aware of what his troops represented, ordered them to move on to the next mission. Fate had placed them in one of the most critical regions of the conflict. Intelligence had intercepted information about a Japanese underground complex that could change the course of the war. Fear of failure was no longer an option. Lucas prepared for the mission with a clouded mind. He knew that even if they managed to destroy the enemy facilities, what really mattered was no longer the war. It was the emptiness he felt inside, the pain of losing his mother and Laurie's distant love. That night, as darkness fell, Lucas and Paul took up position in a nearby trench, awaiting the signal to assault. Tension was palpable in the air, and the distant echo of gunfire came as a reminder of the horror that would never stop. "What do you think, brother?" Paul asked, looking at Lucas from the darkness. Lucas didn't answer right away. His mind was somewhere else, in a future that would never come. Finally, he broke the silence with a low sigh. "I just want it to end, Paul. I want to see Lori Lily. But I feel like we're getting further away from that." Paul nodded. "I know, but there is no turning back. Now we just have to move forward." And so they did. As the platoon advanced toward their objective, each step was marked by the anxiety of what might await them at the end. The Japanese compound was a labyrinth of tunnels and corridors, packed with soldiers ready to defend their position to their last breath. The explosion that marked the start of the assault resounded in the air. The fighting was fierce, more intense than ever. Guns thundered, grenades exploded, and sweat and blood mixed on the ground. Lucas advanced with his gaze fixed, shooting without thinking, driven by the need to survive. Paul, as always, was at his side, shouting war cries, drawing the others along with his fierce determination. There was no time for doubt. No room for regret. Amid the chaos, the faces of the Japanese soldiers were fading fast, victims of the violence that the conflict had unleashed. Finally, upon reaching the heart of the complex, Lucas found what they had been looking for: the documents that would confirm the defeat of that enemy sector. But while the others celebrated the victory, Lucas only felt the weight of the decisions that had brought him there. There was no joy in victory, only more wounds to heal, more sacrifices to recount. At that moment, Lucas understood that the war had not only scarred them physically, but had erased any vestige of their humanity. Everything seemed to have become quiet when suddenly the silence was broken by the distant roar of engines. A Japanese platoon was coming towards them en masse, advancing rapidly like an unstoppable wave. Lucas and Paul, along with their platoon, barely had time to react. Without warning, the ground vibrated with the thunder of gunfire. "Take cover!" the commander shouted. At that moment, chaos erupted. Everyone threw themselves to the ground looking for any kind of cover that would offer them respite. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the pungent scent of gunpowder. Lucas, with his gaze fixed and his heart racing, did not hesitate. He grabbed his rifle and began to fire blindly, guided by pure survival instinct. Every bullet he fired felt like it could be his last. Grenades were their next option. Lucas threw them without measuring, with the precision that only experience could give him. The ground exploded around them. The bodies of the Japanese soldiers flew through the air while their screams were drowned out by the roar of the explosions. But despite the efforts of both sides, the forces did not yield. Neither of them seemed willing to take a step back. The Japanese came closer and closer, giving them no chance to reload their weapons. Screams and the clanging of swords began to fill the scene. Lucas saw one of the Japanese soldiers, katana in hand, lunge at him. His face was a mask of fury, a beast in human form. Without time to think, Lucas dropped his rifle and pulled out his knife, a simple but lethal instrument. The Japanese attacked him with speed and fury, his katana cutting through the air with a deadly whistle. Lucas, trained to deal with these situations, skillfully dodged the attacks, his body moving with the fluidity of years of training. Every time the Japanese knife brushed his face, his adrenaline increased, his breathing became heavier, but his movements did not lose precision. The Japanese soldier attempted a decisive blow, a horizontal slash, but Lucas ducked and, in a swift movement, plunged his knife into the enemy's throat, feeling the resistance of the metal piercing the flesh. Blood gushed forth like a fountain, and the Japanese fell to his knees, staring at Lucas with empty eyes before collapsing to the ground, his life instantly extinguished. The fighting around them continued, the sound of swords clashing against knives, the screams, the bodies falling. It was all a torrent of chaos. Paul, beside him, was engaged in a brutal fight against another Japanese soldier. His knife sank into his enemy's abdomen, opening a deep wound. Blood gushed out in a thick stream, soaking his clothes and the ground around him. But Paul didn't stop. He felt nothing, only the drive to keep going, to survive. In battle, rules were broken. There was no honor, only a primal need to keep living. Men fought like animals, desperation in their eyes, blood already dried on their skin. War had turned everyone into monsters. And in that moment, Lucas and Paul were no different. They felt no fear, only a blind rage, a need for revenge for all that had been taken from them. After what seemed like an eternity, the Japanese platoon finally stopped, slowly falling one after another until silence reigned again. But this silence was different. It was not peace, but a deathly calm that covered the battlefield. Lucas looked around. The ground was covered with corpses, some Japanese, some American. The earth was scarred with the imprint of violence. The fighting was over, but the price had been high. Each fallen soldier seemed to take with him a part of the humanity those left behind. "This is never going to end, is it?" Paul said, wiping blood from his hands, as he looked at the fallen bodies. Lucas didn't answer. Only one word echoed in his mind: asterisk and asterisk. But the end was still far away. The platoon quickly gathered together. There was no time to rest. In the distance, they could hear the gunshots and screams that continued beyond the horizon, like a shadow that would never leave them. The war continued, and Lucas was once again drawn into it, not knowing how much more he could endure. They continued to fight, each with their minds focused on survival. The tension was palpable, but it seemed that calm had finally arrived, at least momentarily. The gunshots died down, the screams ceased, and the air became still, covered only by the thick smoke of past explosions. Paul, with a tight smile, looked at Lucas and said, "I told you, buddy, that we would get through this." But his words hung in the air, incomplete. Paul felt a sharp pain in his abdomen. Before he could react, he looked down and saw blood gushing out rapidly. A Japanese man who had been pretending to be dead stood up and, with deadly speed, plunged the katana into his abdomen. The sword moved deftly, seeking to ensure that Paul did not survive. The Japanese man began to move the katana rapidly, making precise cuts, trying to leave him with no chance of reaction. Horror gripped Lucas when he saw his friend in that situation. Without thinking, he launched himself at the Japanese with the fury of a wounded animal, moving quickly in an impulse of revenge. With deadly precision, he threw the knife he was carrying at him, which stuck directly in the attacker's head. The Japanese fell instantly to the ground, but Lucas's anger was not over. With a roar of rage, he stood up, along with other comrades who had also seen what happened. They grabbed their machine guns and, in a frenzy of fury, opened fire. The bullets pierced the Japanese's body again and again, turning him into a mass of disfigured, unrecognizable flesh, a body turned to jam by the brutality of the attack. Lucas's fury did not cease. The bursts continued, as if he himself could vent all the rage accumulated during that infernal war. The Japanese man's body was practically disintegrated, reduced to pieces. Lucas kept shooting, his mind fixed on only one thing: avenging the death of his friend Paul. Each bullet fired seemed to be a cry of pain, a lament in the form of violence. War, with all its atrocities, had taken so much, and now Lucas felt that nothing could bring back what was lost. When the fire finally died down, the silence that followed was even more somber than before. The ground, now covered in blood, reflected the reality of war. No one went without paying a price. Lucas, panting, still held his machine gun. But his eyes never left the broken body of the Japanese. Anger still burned within him, but now he was also enveloped by a feeling of emptiness. The cost of revenge was higher than he had ever imagined. "I swear, Paul, I swear this isn't over," Lucas muttered, his voice filled with desperation and rage as he looked at the destruction around him. The war continued, and he, now more than ever, felt like his soul was being lost in the midst of that madness. Paul was still moving, his breathing ragged from the pain, but the adrenaline kept his body moving, fighting to stay conscious. His hands shook as he tried to hold the wound in his abdomen, but he knew there was no turning back. The blood was flowing hard, and his vision was beginning to blur. With one last smile, he looked at Lucas, his lifelong friend, and said in a weak voice, "Dude, you were a brother. And don't tell my wife that a Japanese killed me. Tell her that I was killed by a piece of gum or something. Do me that favor." Lucas, looking at his friend, couldn't stop the tears from welling up in his eyes. Paul's smile, even in his final moments, was the same one he had always worn in his worst battles, the same one he had shared on so many nights of camping under the same starry sky. That smile that never faded, not even when death was lurking. Lucas, between sobs and forced smiles, answered with a broken voice, "I swear, Paul, I won't tell anyone. No one will know that a damn Japanese did it to you. I'll just say that you were killed by chewing gum, or some other absurd thing, like you always did." Despite the tears blurring his vision, Lucas tried to smile, even though the pain stabbed him like a knife through his heart. Paul had always been the one who kept his cool, the one who found a joke even in the midst of chaos, the one who never lost hope. And now, in his last breath, that damned sense of humor was still there, like a last gift for his friend. You're going to get through this, Lucas. I promise you will," Paul murmured with his eyes half closed, the life fading from his body. With those last words, Paul's life snuffed out. His friend's body sank into the sand, leaving Lucas kneeling beside him, Paul's blood soaking his hands. Paul's smile remained on his face, a final gesture of peace in the midst of the storm. But Lucas could no longer smile. Anger, sadness, and pain intertwined in his chest, while his friend was no longer there. "Damn war," Lucas muttered, clenching his fist tightly. "Damn war that takes everything." The wind, like a cold caress, seemed to whisper through the trees while silence enveloped everything. But inside Lucas, the tumult continued. Paul's death had not only stripped him of a brother in arms, but also of a part of his humanity. The fight, now more than ever, seemed endless, and he didn't know if there was anything left of him that could be saved. But in his heart a spark of fury ignited. This war would not end until he too had his revenge, until they paid for every life that had been lost. Because even if Paul was gone, Lucas would fight on, even if only he remained. The mission was accomplished, but the price had been high. The battlefield, once a scene of fury and chaos, now seemed a merciless graveyard. Blood still stained the earth and the air, saturated with the echo of gunfire and the screams of battle. The few survivors gathered together, silently looking at the disaster they had left behind. Each, with their own burden of pain and loss, knew that victory brought no comfort. The mission was accomplished, but the void was immense. Lucas looked around, taking in the bodies of his fallen comrades, Paul's face still etched in his mind. Each of those men had given something in that battle, something that couldn't be returned. The war had taken away what was most precious to them. But the need to keep going still throbbed in his chest. Even though the exhaustion consumed him, even though the wounds burned, there was still one purpose: the mission. And as long as he was standing, he would keep fighting, no matter how far he went or what the cost. The commander approached him, his eyes empty of emotion, as if he no longer had the strength to feel. However, there was something in his gaze that said everything he needed to know. War was not just a matter of orders and victories. It was a cruel game in which only the strongest or the most stubborn survived. "Are we ready to go?" the commander asked, his voice raspy as if each word was difficult for him. Lucas nodded but said nothing. He took one last look at the battlefield, where the sun was beginning to descend on the horizon, dyeing the sky a dark red. There was no glory in that scene, only death. The war had taken its toll, and the price was higher than many could imagine. "Come on," Lucas said, turning around. "We have to get back." The men began to walk, some shuffling, others barely standing. The mission was accomplished, but in their hearts there was a void that could never be filled. The war did not end when the last bullet was fired, not when the objective was achieved. The war continued, deeper inside, where no one could see it. As they walked forward, Lucas couldn't stop thinking about Paul, about his promise not to tell the truth about his death. Even though it had been a simple joke, those words now weighed on him like a burden. Paul had been more than a comrade in arms. He had been his friend, his brother. And now, in this broken world, his absence was a hole that could not be filled with anything. The mission was accomplished, yes, but Lucas knew that no matter how many battles he won, none of them would bring back those who had fallen, nor heal the wounds that the war had left on his soul. In the distance, the first stars began to appear in the sky like small flashes of hope in the midst of darkness. But Lucas knew that the war continued, and inside him, the scars of that war would never disappear. The mission was accomplished, but the fight, his fight, was just beginning. They went home, carrying with them the weight of war, a burden that was not relieved even by the return to the apparent calm of their lives. Lucas, along with the few who had survived, dedicated the following weeks to organizing the funerals of their fallen comrades. Each ceremony was a brutal reminder of what they had lost, of the sacrifices those men made for a cause that, with time, began to seem empty. The first to be sent away was Paul. Lucas took on the responsibility of delivering his friend's personal belongings to his wife, a woman with a tired look and a face hardened by constant waiting and fear. When he arrived at the house, he was greeted with a deathly silence. Paul's children were playing in the backyard, oblivious to the tragedy that had changed their lives forever. Paul's wife, Elizabeth, looked at him with a mixture of anguish and resignation. Before she could say anything, Lucas held out his friend's backpack. Her voice broke for a moment. He wanted me to tell you that he died like a hero, that he fought until his last breath. Elizabeth took the backpack carefully, as if the object itself might break, and nodded. There were no tears in that moment, only a painful silence that seemed to scream louder than any words. Lucas knew Elizabeth wanted answers, but he also knew no explanation would be enough. That evening, at the small ceremony organized by the community, Lucas stood by Paul's coffin. The priest spoke words of comfort, but Lucas barely listened. His mind was caught up in memories, in his friend's final moments, in his jokes, even in the face of death. When it was his turn to speak, he cleared his throat and, in a voice heavy with emotion, said, "Paul was not just a soldier. He was a friend, a brother to many of us. Even in his final moments, he found a way to make us smile. That was the man he was. And although his absence leaves a void in us, I am sure that his spirit lives on in each one of us. He did not die for an empty cause. He died for us, for his family, for a future that, although uncertain, is worth fighting for." After the words, those present began to place flowers on the coffin. Lucas, with a rose in his hand, carefully dropped it and murmured, "I promise I'll take care of them, Paul." The following days were a cycle of farewells. Each ceremony was more difficult than the last, because each fallen soldier had a story, a life, a family that now had to learn to live without them. Lucas attended them all with his impeccable uniform and his hardened gaze, but inside he felt like something was breaking more with each afflicted face he saw. When the last of the ceremonies was over, Lucas headed back to his home. It was a modest house with white walls and a garden that had grown too long in his absence. As he entered, he was greeted by a familiar aroma, the coffee his girlfriend always made in the afternoons. "Lucas!" she shouted from the living room, her voice thick with emotion. Lucas barely had time to respond when she came running up to him. Her prominent belly was the first thing he noticed. It was more advanced than he had imagined. In that instant, all the weight of the war seemed to fade away. Without thinking, he hugged her tightly, wrapping his arms around her as if he wanted to protect her from all the pain he had experienced. With tears in her eyes, she caressed his face, feeling the invisible scars she knew he carried with him. "I thought you weren't coming back," she whispered. "I always come back to you," Lucas replied, his voice cracking as he rested his forehead against hers. He stayed like that, holding her for what seemed like an eternity. Lucas's hands rested on her belly, feeling the gentle movements of the baby growing inside her. For the first time in a long time, a spark of hope lit up his heart. This was the future he had fought for. The life that Paul and so many others had not been able to live. "You know," she said, smiling through her tears, "I think it's going to be a boy, just as strong as his father." Lucas let out a soft laugh, and for a moment, the darkness of war was left behind. Now more than ever, he was determined to protect them, to build a future worthy of his and his companion's sacrifice. That night, while the world around him seemed to sleep, Lucas sat next to his girlfriend on the couch. They listened to the small monitor that marked the rhythm of their son's heart. That sound, so simple and vital, became the anchor that would keep him steadfast in the days to come. Lucas knew that the war was not over inside him, but he also knew that he now had something bigger to fight for, a family waiting for him, a home that promised to be a refuge, and the memory of the fallen that he would never stop honoring. As the months passed, Lori finally gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The house, which until recently seemed shrouded in the melancholy of war memories, was now filled with the sweet cries and laughter of a new beginning. They decided to call him Simon, a name that, for Lucas, represented strength, hope, and the possibility of a different future. The day of birth was one of those moments that would remain etched in Lucas's memory forever. He stood beside Lori in the hospital room, holding her hand as she, her face beaded with sweat and a titanic effort, brought their son into the world. When he heard the baby's first cry, a wave of emotions ran through him. Relief, joy, and a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. Lori, exhausted but smiling, looked at him tenderly as he took little Simon into his arms for the first time. His skin was soft, his eyes barely open, and his tiny body seemed fragile. But Lucas felt like he was carrying the weight of the world at that moment. Lori whispered, her voice weak but full of love. Lori's forehead, and then Simon, is silently promising himself that he would protect his family at all costs. As the months went by, life at home changed completely. Days of silence and reflection gave way to sleepless nights spent changing diapers and calming Simon's cries. Although the routine was exhausting, Lucas found in those small moments a happiness he never thought possible. Simon was growing fast, and with every smile and babble he brought joy to the house. Lori, on the other hand, seemed to have adapted naturally to motherhood. Lucas watched her silently as she sang to the baby or fed him, and he fell more and more in love with her. One afternoon, while playing with Simon in the garden, Lucas felt the shadow of war begin to lift from his heart. His son's contagious laughter made him forget for a moment the pain and misses he had suffered. "Look at him," Lori Lucas said, lifting the boy above his head as he laughed loudly. "It's amazing how someone so small can bring so much happiness." Lori, who was watching them from the porch with a cup of tea in her hand, smiled widely. "It's because it reminds us that there are still good things in this world, Lucas. Things worth fighting for." Lucas dropped Simon to the ground and walked over to her. He took her hand and, for a moment, allowed himself to forget the past. However, life was not without its challenges. Even though Lucas tried to put the war behind him, the ghosts of his past would not leave him alone. At night, when all was quiet, he would find himself awake, staring at the ceiling as he remembered the faces of those who had not returned. Dreams would transport him back to the battlefield, and more than once he would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and panting, feeling like he still had to fight for his life. Lori could tell, even though he tried to hide it. One night, while Simon was sleeping in his crib, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into space. "Lucas," she said, walking over to him and placing a hand on his shoulder, "I know you're struggling with this, but you don't have to face it alone. I'm here. I'll always be here." Lucas nodded, but couldn't stop a tear from sliding down his cheek. "Sometimes I feel like I don't deserve this, Lori. Sometimes I think about Paul, about the others, and I don't understand why they couldn't come back." Lori hugged him tightly, allowing him to unload all the weight he carried inside. "They wanted you to live, Lucas. They wanted you to have this chance. Honor their memory by living for them, for us." Over time, Lucas began to find ways to deal with his pain. He joined a group of war veterans, men and women, who were also struggling to find peace after the conflict. Sharing their stories and hearing those of others helped him heal little by little. Meanwhile, Simon continued to grow up, and with him the responsibilities and joys of being a father. Lucas realized that although he could never completely erase the scars of war, he had the opportunity to build a better future for his son. One day, while they were walking in the park, Simon, who was already beginning to take his first steps, broke away from Lucas's hand and ran towards a group of children playing in the grass. "Laurie," he laughed as Lucas followed him, making sure he didn't get hurt. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Laurie said, looking at him lovingly. "Everything we've been through, and here we are, watching our son explore the world." Lucas smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years. "Yes, Laurie, here we are. And I wouldn't change any of this for anything in the world." The war had left its mark, but it had also taught him to value every moment, every smile, every small step towards the future. Now, with his family by his side, Lucas was ready to face whatever came, because he knew that together they could overcome anything. The connection between Lucas, Laurie, and Simon grew day by day. The house, once a refuge from the silences and shadows of the past, now resonated with the murmur of life. Simon's babbling, Laurie's laughter, and Lucas's kind words filled every corner. Simon, with his curious gaze and clumsy movements, was the center of everything. His first attempts at crawling had excited Laurie and Lucas more than they could have imagined. Laurie would often fall on the floor with him, encouraging him to keep moving while Lucas watched from the couch with a proud smile. He's growing up so fast, Lucas," Laurie said one day as she helped Simon stand up, holding him with both hands. "Too fast," he replied, leaning down to kiss the little boy's forehead. It seemed like just yesterday we were holding him in the hospital. Nights at home had become bonding times. After dinner, Laurie and Lucas would often take turns holding Simon and rocking him to sleep. Sometimes Simon would fall fast asleep on Lucas's chest as he hummed a soft melody to him, remembering those childhood songs his mother used to sing to him. Laurie watched tenderly from the bedroom door, marveling at the unconditional love Lucas showed his son. On weekends, the family would venture to the nearby park. Although Simon wasn't walking yet, he enjoyed sitting on the grass, watching in fascination the leaves rustling in the wind or the erratic flight of butterflies. Lucas and Laurie would take turns holding him in their arms and walking slowly, showing him the world around him. One afternoon, while Laurie was packing up for the picnic, Lucas lifted Simon to the air, gently spinning him around. "You're my little champion," Simon Lucas whispered, with a smile. Simon mumbled something unintelligible, but his eyes sparkled with joy as he reached out his tiny hands toward his father's face. Laurie, watching the scene from afar, couldn't help but feel completely happy. At last, Lucas had something that seemed to fill the voids that the war had left inside him. Every moment with Simon and Laurie was a reminder that life wasn't just about battles and losses, but also about small triumphs and deep connections. Although the road to this point had been difficult, Lucas knew he now had something worth pushing forward for. Simon was his hope, and Laurie his anchor. Their home was not just a physical place, but the space where love and joy were woven into every shared moment. The day of Lucas's recognition arrived with clear skies and a light breeze that fluttered the American flag over the podium. The ceremony took place in a spacious military park, surrounded by fellow soldiers, high-ranking officers, families, and friends. The marching band played softly, filling the air with a solemn but hopeful atmosphere. Lucas, dressed in his impeccable uniform, walked towards the podium with a firm step. On his chest shone the 10 medals he had been awarded for his bravery, leadership, and sacrifice on the battlefield. Despite the applause and admiring glances, His attention was directed to Lori, who held Simon in her arms in the front row. She looked at him with pride and love, as if the whole world stopped just for them. The ceremony began with a tribute to the fallen soldiers. A platoon fired into the air in a sign of respect, and the echo of the shots resonated in the hearts of all present. Lucas put his hand to his chest, remembering Paul and so many others who did not return. Emotion overwhelmed him, but he took a deep breath, determined to honor them with his words. When it was his turn, Lucas stepped up to the podium, faced the audience, and took the microphone firmly. "I am not here today to talk about myself, but about them," he began, gesturing toward the photographs of fallen soldiers displayed beside the podium. "Each of these medals I wear does not belong to me alone. They represent the sacrifice of my comrades, my friends, men and women who gave everything for this nation and for their families." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "They were more than soldiers. They were sons, husbands, fathers, brothers. And even though they are not physically here, their legacy lives on in each one of us." The audience listened in reverent silence. Lori, with tears in her eyes, gently held Simon against her chest, feeling the weight of Lucas's words. "Today, I also want to thank our families, those who have been with us in the darkest times and who give us the strength to keep going." To my wife, Lori, Lucas looked directly at her, his voice softening. "You are my rock, my beacon in the middle of the storm. And to my son Simon, although he can't understand my words yet, I hope that one day he knows how much I love him and how much he inspires me to be better every day." The crowd erupted in applause, but Lucas barely noticed. His heart was filled, not with personal pride, but with gratitude for all he still had. After the speech, officials presented him with ceremonial medals and invited him to raise the flag in honor of the fallen and survivors. With Lori and Simon at his side, Lucas took the rope and raised the flag as the band played the national anthem. The wind unfurled it majestically, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still. Lori looked at him, her heart filled with admiration. In her eyes, Lucas was not just a war hero. He was a dedicated husband, a loving father, and the man who had overcome the impossible to protect everything he loved. When the ceremony was over, families came up to congratulate him. Some of Lucas's classmates, visibly moved, hugged him and thanked him for his words. Lori, with Simon in her arms, joined him. Lucas put his arm around her and kissed her forehead while stroking Simon's little head. "I'm so proud of you," Lori whispered. "Everything I do is for you," Lucas replied, with a smile that reflected both tiredness and happiness. That day didn't just mark an official recognition. It was a reminder of how far Lucas had come and how much he still had to experience with his family. Lucas and Lori arrived home after the ceremony. The afternoon was slipping gently into night, and the house was quiet, barely lit by the warm lights coming through the windows. Lori, as always, knew how to create that cozy atmosphere. She went straight to the kitchen, as if it was all part of a routine, while Lucas slumped into the armchair, exhausted, but with his mind still caught in the echoes of the words spoken at the podium. I'm going to make coffee," Lori said, smiling softly. Lucas just nodded, not moving his gaze from the horizon through the window. The sound of boiling water and the aroma of coffee slowly filled the house, creating an atmosphere of calm, but something didn't fit. While she was preparing the cups, Lucas got up and walked over to the radio that was in the corner of the living room. He turned the dial slowly until he found a station, looking for a distraction in the music. But the announcer's voice broke the tranquility, his tone grave and solemn, immediately injecting a tension that could not be ignored. "In the latest news from August, the war continues unabated. Allied forces continue to clash with Japanese resistance in the Pacific, specifically on Guadalcanal, a conflict that seems to have no end. Lucas stopped scrolling, listening intently as the news continued. Guadalcanal, a name that turned his stomach and filled him with memories of blood, mud, and despair. The newscaster's words seemed empty to him, as if they no longer had any meaning. The war, that unstoppable monster, continued, as if nothing had changed, as if the lives sacrificed meant nothing. Lucas closed his eyes, and suddenly, memories hit him hard. The roar of explosions, the sound of bullets, the faces of his fallen comrades, Paul, the confusion, the chaos, the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle. Everything he had lived through seemed like a nightmare that never ended. The radio continued with its report, but Lucas couldn't listen to it anymore. He bit his own lips until the pain woke him from his trance. Hatred and resentment, that darkness that had never completely gone away, arose like a heavy shadow over him. Laurie watched him from the kitchen, noticing the change in his attitude, although she didn't know how to deal with it. "Love, are you okay?" she asked, approaching him cautiously, as if she feared that any wrong word might unleash something even darker in him. Lucas didn't answer immediately. His face was marked by palpable tension. Finally, he looked up at her. "Yes, I'm fine," he replied. But his eyes didn't lie. There was a coldness in his gaze that was unusual for him, as if a layer of ice enveloped his being. Laurie didn't know how to help him, but she was sure she couldn't keep ignoring the part of Lucas that seemed to have been torn away from him in the heat of war. There was something inside him that changed every day. And although she wanted to believe that life at home would heal him, she wasn't so sure it would be enough. Lucas clenched his fists as if he wanted to hold on to something, anything that would allow him to move forward without being consumed by that darkness. But the weight of the war still loomed, and even though he was with Laurie and his son, the echo of the gunfire and the thunder of the battles would never completely leave him. The war, in many ways, had never ended. The next day, the sun began to peek through the window, painting the walls of the house gold. The ray of light was warm, but Lucas was already awake. The custom of war had made him get up at 4 in the morning, even though he was no longer on the battlefield. He slept barely 5 hours a day, a cycle he had adopted during the months of conflict, like a persistent shadow that did not let him rest completely. He quietly got out of bed, trying not to make any noise. He looked at Laurie, who was still sleeping soundly, with a peaceful expression on her face. He slowly approached her and gave her a soft kiss on the forehead without waking her up. That small caress gave her some peace, although her mind was still trapped between memories of war. As he turned to get up, his eyes fell on little Simon asleep in his crib, oblivious to the outside world. A feeling of tenderness washed over him, but also a strange sense of bewilderment. The life he had chosen now seemed to be a contradiction to what he had faced in the past. War, violence, sacrifices. And now he, a man with a family that still slept peacefully. Lucas approached the crib to pick up Simon, but Laurie, hearing the slight movement, woke up and gently stopped him. "Let him sleep. He's not a soldier yet, Lucas," she said, smiling as she rubbed her eyes. Lucas let out a small laugh, a nostalgic laugh, as if he still couldn't let go of the part of him that had been formed on the battlefields. "You're right," she replied, lowering her voice so as not to disturb the baby's sleep. "He still has plenty of time before he's woken by the battle cries." Laurie slowly stood up and walked into the kitchen. Lucas followed, still smiling. He stood behind her as she prepared breakfast, as if this moment of normalcy gave her some humanity back. The sound of the coffee pot filled the room with a comforting aroma, and Laurie began making toast and eggs with calm, confident skill. Lucas approached her without saying a word and hugged her from behind, wrapping his arms around her waist. Lori smiled at his touch, feeling that despite everything, the war had left room for something good in their lives. "Shall we dance a little?" Lucas asked, raising his head to look into her eyes. Lori, surprised but delighted, did not hesitate for a second. Without saying a word, she accepted the gesture, letting herself be guided by it. Together, in the middle of the kitchen, they began to move gently to the rhythm of a melody that neither of them had planned. It was a spontaneous dance without pretensions, just two people who, in the midst of the calm of their home, found a small refuge in the connection between their bodies. The sound of the outside world, the worries and memories, seemed to fade away for a moment. There was only them for each other. The dance, though simple, was a silent declaration that despite everything, there was still room for hope and beauty in their lives. And as they continued dancing, the aroma of breakfast grew stronger. The sun shone more brightly on the house, and little Simon continued sleeping, oblivious to everything, in his crib as the day began. The afternoon arrived, and with it, a feeling of calm that invaded the house. Lucas, with a broad smile, approached Lori, who was finishing organizing some things in the living room. Seeing his wife, an idea occurred to him. "Who wants to go to the cafeteria for some chocolate donuts?" she exclaimed enthusiastically, almost as if she had found a perfect excuse to get out of her routine. Lori, with a light laugh, looked at Simon, who was playing with his little toys, and then, with a mischievous smile, imitated the baby's voice. "I want to, Daddy," she said in a tender tone, as if Simon were speaking. Lucas couldn't help but laugh. He loved how Lori found ways to make everything more fun, even the simplest moments. "Let's go then," he replied, happy to see his wife in such high spirits. With Simon in their arms and smiles on both their faces, they headed out to the neighborhood coffee shop. Upon arrival, the warm afternoon breeze welcomed them, and as they walked through the door, something strange happened. The customers in the coffee shop, upon seeing Lucas enter, began to applaud. It was something unexpected, but at that moment, Lucas felt like a hero again. Not the hero of war, but the hero in his home and in his community. People looked at him with respect and affection, as a man who, after everything he had been through, continued to fight for the most important thing, his family. The owner of the cafe, an older man with a big smile, approached her and, in a warm tone, said, "It's on the house, my friend. Order whatever you want. You deserve it for everything you do for this country." Lucas looked at Lori, who smiled proudly, and then, with a gesture of humility, accepted the owner's offer. They sat at a comfortable table by a window overlooking the park. While Lucas and Lori made themselves comfortable, Simon sat quietly in his chair, looking curiously around. The waiters came over and served them chocolate donuts, milk, and coffee, creating a small oasis of normality in the midst of everything that had happened. The atmosphere was relaxed and pleasant. The applause faded away, but the feeling of support and gratitude remained in the air. As they ate, little Simon began to laugh, his soft, pure laughter filling the space with a hint of joy. Lori couldn't help but look at him lovingly, feeling that, little by little, everything she had been through had become worth it. Seeing his wife's expression, Lucas began to tell some funny stories about his time with Paul, his old war friend. There was something in his tone that made even the darkest memories seem light. Something in his way of telling anecdotes that managed to make Lori laugh. "You remember when Paul—" Lucas started laughing to himself at the memory, tried to make a joke about a Japanese soldier. But he didn't know the guy spoke Spanish. The poor guy just stared at Paul like he was possessed. Lori couldn't help but laugh out loud. The sound of her laughter, so full of life, made Lucas feel even closer to her. It was in those moments, in those small, everyday things, that Lucas felt he had found something that the war couldn't steal from him: his family, his love, his peace. And that dark joke Paul made about the grenade. Lucas continued, "I'll never forget it." He was so nervous, but he still kept cracking jokes. Those were his days, always living on the edge and finding humor in even the darkest things. Lori, laughing, gently punched him on the arm. "You need to stop telling those jokes, Lucas," she said, though her voice was full of affection. "But I love it when you laugh. It makes me feel like everything is okay." Lucas looked at her, his eyes shining with a mix of affection and sadness. The war had left him with scars, but seeing his family happy and Lori smiling made him feel like there was something bigger to keep fighting for, something more worthwhile. The atmosphere was warm, and the baby continued to laugh as Lucas and Lori continued to talk. The afternoon passed peacefully with the feeling that everything, for a brief moment, was in its place. And Lucas, despite the horrors he had experienced, had found refuge in the love of his family. Finally, after enjoying the donuts and coffee, they got up to leave. But just as they were about to leave, an unknown figure entered the premises, drawing the attention of everyone present. The atmosphere in the coffee shop changed immediately. The man wore a black beret, a dark trench coat that fell elegantly to his ankles, round glasses that hid his eyes, and leather gloves that made his every move seem calculated. When he walked through the door, the atmosphere in the cafe immediately changed, becoming tense, as if the very air foreshadowed the inevitable. With eerie calm, he raised his hand and in impeccable Japanese said loudly, "Watashi no kodomo, tachi ni shita koto, o kangaereba anata wa kore ni atasuru deshu." "If you think about what you've done to my children, you'll understand." Before anyone could react, the man pulled out a gun and fired with precision. The first shot hit Lori in the head, and the second, aimed at her son Simon, killed him instantly. The cafeteria was filled with screams and chaos, but Lucas remained motionless, the pain paralyzing him, his world crumbling before his eyes. The man had planned everything, had investigated his life, and had sought revenge on him for the death of his own children. Lucas understood that, although death seemed to be the only way out, something else was about to happen. With his soul shattered and pain burning in his chest, Lucas slowly stood up, looking at the corpse of the Japanese man and his family. He couldn't let all this be in vain. Something inside him, an icy fury and a desire for justice, pushed him to get up and move on. The suffering of that loss had marked him forever, but it had also transformed him into a man determined to avenge his family. The death of his family would not go unanswered. The police arrived, followed closely by the ambulance. Sirens blared through the empty streets, but inside the coffee shop, it was deathly quiet. Police officers rushed to cover the scene, taking photos and asking questions. But everyone seemed aware that nothing they could do would give Lucas back what he had lost. The place was filled with chaos. Grief hung in the air like a thick fog, and still Lucas remained motionless. He didn't make a single sound, he didn't even move. At first, the officers tried to talk to him, but he ignored them. His face was completely disfigured by pain, his eyes empty, as if nothing could bring him out of this nightmare. The police thought he might be in shock, but the truth was that Lucas had already crossed the threshold of despair. The death of his family had left him completely devastated, plunged into a fog of helplessness. They asked the owner of the cafe, an elderly man who could barely keep his cool, and he began to tell the story, trembling. "A man came in here wearing a black beret, a dark trench coat, round glasses and leather gloves. No one saw him come. Suddenly he said something in Japanese, something we didn't understand, and before we could react, he pulled out a gun and fired. He shot the woman and the child. Then he shot himself." The owner's words didn't seem to make any impression on Lucas, who continued to stare into space, as if his mind was thousands of miles away. The officers, not getting any answers, focused on the scene, making sure everything was documented. After doing their job, the officers accompanied Lori and Simon's bodies to the morgue so they could be prepared for their wake. The ambulance took them both away without Lucas moving from the spot. No one dared to say anything to him. They knew that their words meant nothing at that moment. The pain, the rage, the confusion, all of that loomed over him like a relentless shadow. When the time came to mourn Lori and Simon, Lucas was supposed to be with his family at their side. But something inside him broke completely. He couldn't do it. He couldn't imagine looking at the bodies of the two people he loved, knowing he would never see them again. He knew that seeing them like that would only make him sink deeper into despair. So he stayed home, sitting in the dark, while the world went on. The days passed slowly, but time seemed meaningless to Lucas. Every moment he spent at home, alone in his grief, seemed like an eternity. Neighbors whispered amongst themselves, friends asked what had happened, but no one seemed to have an answer. No one understood how someone could have done something so horrible, or why. The tragedy had left an indelible mark, and the entire city was plunged into a shroud of uncertainty. Lucas, however, wouldn't answer anyone's questions. He sat by the window, watching the rain fall as if it were the only thing that could comfort him. Sometimes he felt like everything that had happened was a dream he couldn't wake up from. Other times he wished he'd never woken up. He wondered if he could ever find the strength to move on, if the pain would ever fade away, or if it would just stay there next to him like a shadow that would never leave him alone. The visits to the wake were brief and silent. People came, left flowers, and left without knowing what to say. Lucas couldn't bear to be there, in that place full of pitying glances, empty words that couldn't fill the emptiness in his chest. No one could understand what he felt, or how he could move on after such a great loss. Days passed, and sadness began to take the form of unbearable anguish. Every corner of the house reminded him of what he had lost. At night, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Memories of Lori and Simon haunted him, but anger also began to grow inside him. He couldn't let all this go unpunished. The Japanese man, the one who had destroyed his life, had to pay for what he had done. Rage drove him to get up, to seek answers, to find the justice that had not been served. Despite the devastation he felt, he knew he had a mission. The death of his family would not go unanswered. The pain, though unbearable, became his driving force. And with that, Lucas decided that even though the world had fallen apart, he would not let that tragedy be just a reminder of his suffering. He would seek revenge one way or another. He would not rest until they paid for what they did.